Hi, I'm Michael McPadden from the Tango API team with another tutorial for Tango's Mobile Procurement REST API, sometimes known as MobProc for short. In this video, I'll guide you through how to create and submit an order request to suspend, unsuspend, or deactivate a service asset. But before we dive in, let me just quickly explain the difference between a suspension and a deactivation. Suspension of a service is expected to be a temporary shutting off of a specific service asset. For example, this might be done when someone is unavailable to use a service for an extended period of time for a reason such as maternity leave or sabbatical, or if the cell phone is lost and you want to prevent any calls on it until the device can be recovered. When it is found, an unsuspend order request can be submitted to turn the service back on. You will need to check with each carrier to determine the maximum amount of time that they will allow a service to be suspended. In the United States, carriers like Verizon and AT&T will allow up to 90 days. But again, it could vary by carrier, so you'll want to verify the time period for your particular case. A deactivation is the permanent shutting down of a service asset. Please keep in mind that once a service is turned off, the service number will be released. If service is wanted at some time in the future, a new service asset will need to be procured via the new activation transaction type. Even though there are 3 distinct transaction types for suspending, unsuspending, and deactivating a service, you will see that the order process is very similar for all 3. Okay, now let's discuss how we put together an order request. There are 4 basic steps to creating an order request. Authentication is the verification that the user making the API call is actually who they claim to be. Users are authenticated with every API call. Setting request headers. In this API, request headers are primarily used to refine context. The most common example of them is using them to execute a transaction on behalf of another user, who is sometimes known as the quote-unquote actor. Also, certain request headers can also be used to tag a single call or a group of related calls with a unique identifier that can be used to easily locate these calls in an activity log file. For a detailed overview of what headers are available and how they can be used, please check out our video library for the video explaining request headers. The request body, written in JSON, is the heart of the order request. It contains all of the data needed by the source system to process the order. In a minute, I'll show you how to assemble that JSON. The final aspect of an order request is indicating whether or not you want back the order request confirmation or if you're submitting the request for processing. Typically, you'll want to obtain a confirmation before submitting your order, and as you'll see, the order confirmation returns all of the IDs passed in with the request body JSON, along with human-readable data that fully describes what is referenced by those IDs, such as a device name, vendor, price, etc. This is very useful for API consumers who want to present their order request back to their end user so that they can verify it for accuracy. When an order is submitted, if successful, the API will return an HTTP status code of 200, along with various data describing the order details, including the newly assigned order number. If not successful, the error status code along with error information will be returned instead. Before I demonstrate placing an order, let me first tell you about the 4 things that must be included in the JSON request body. The transaction type indicates the type of order you wish to place: suspend, unsuspend, or deactivate. The service ID is the ID of the service you wish to modify. The external order number is an order number, tracking number, or some other reference number generated by the carrier who provides the service. It's a helpful cross-reference back to their ordering system. And the properties block contains the order properties that are used by the carrier to fulfill the order. Please note that a different set of properties is required for each of the 3 order transaction types. Furthermore, the set of properties can vary somewhat for different carriers, even when the transaction type is the same. For more on that, please refer to our video explaining how to obtain order properties. Okay, now let's go to the developer portal and see how to make a call to suspend a service asset. For our orders endpoint, you'll notice that there are 2 HTTP methods offered here, post and get. If we were just looking to pull a collection of orders, then we would be using the get method. But in our case, since we're looking to place an order, we will be using the post method. So I just click on that tab, and that'll take us in to our developer portal's try it feature for this method. We'll click that link, and here we can enter in our form to exercise the API for this endpoint. So first I'll enter my client ID, and this is the client ID that was provided by Tango. You'll have your own unique client ID. And I'll scroll down to my tenant code, which is required, along with again, my client ID also required in the header, and again, you will be provided with both those codes. Okay. First, you'll notice that in our query parameters, we have the option to click confirm. So I'll click that box. And this is saying that before submitting our request for processing, I simply want to get a confirmation back. And as I explained earlier, with all the information so that I can view and verify my order, as well as if I choose to, present it back to my end user if I'm using this in the context of an application. Okay, next we'll go down to our request body. And here you'll notice that by default, we present an example of request body for a new activation. I'm going to clear that out and put in a blank template and show you how we build up our request body JSON for a suspend. First, I'll enter a sample external order number that would have been provided by my carrier. And this is just, again, a cross-reference back to their ordering system, but it would be some identifier provided by them. Next, I'll enter my transaction type and my service ID. This is the service ID for the asset that is currently assigned to myself, and therefore I'm authorized to modify it. If you don't know the ID for your active service asset, you can use the asset/services endpoint to get that information. And lastly, I'll enter my order properties. As described in another video on the subject, we use the order/properties endpoint to get the properties that were supported for this vendor and transaction type. I'll fill in this array with just the required ones, but you could add any relevant optional ones also. You may have noticed that the values for contact number and service number have been filled in already. These are default values provided by the backend system, and as such, when I made my API call to the order/properties endpoint to get these properties, I passed the query parameters for transaction type and service ID. The response returned defaulted values for both properties. The source system can get the contact number from the employee record and can look up the service number for that service asset. Now, the hold service property, this takes a predetermined choice option that identifies a user or department with which we'll park the suspended service. Again, our choice options are returned with our call to the order/properties endpoint to get our list of available options. So I will just enter in one of the available options that came back with my call, in this case, my company employee ID. And last, we'll enter in a preferred suspension date. Please note that this value is entered in an ISO-8601 date type format. I just want to make a quick note about unsuspend orders before we submit this request. For the unsuspend transaction type, there's a required order property called user. If the API source system is Premium Mobile, also known by some as command, then this property will be defaulted to the company employee ID of the quote-unquote actor who's making the API call. Typically, this is the logged in user, but it could be a different employee if the order is being placed on behalf of another user. Either way, the value of the user property will need to be set to a valid company employee ID. Okay, back to our suspend request. Let's submit our API call request by clicking the post button. Okay, our request was successfully processed, so we now see our confirmation response. Notice how the IDs were used by the source system to look up the related details and return them. An API consumer can use this response and present it back to the end user for them to verify. But specifically, let me just point out a few pieces of data. You can see that the entire response is wrapped in a block named order confirmation, which indicates that we are in this mode. Next, you might notice that the source system was able to infer some valuable information from our login info, headers, elements, and so on within the request body. For example, we see our account holder contains the employee detail records for the logged in user, which is also the person for whom the order is being placed. We see details about the current device associated with the service being suspended also. The source system was able to look this up based on the service ID we passed within our request body JSON. We also see our external order number that we passed in with the request, as well as the order properties. However, now the response includes the data type and human readable label for each order property. This label is helpful not only for helping the API consumer better understand the nature of the property in cases where the ID might be a little cryptic, but it's also helpful, again, if they want to display it back to their end user for verification. We also see the service containing details about the service being suspended, including our service number, which is typically far more recognizable to the end user than the service ID. And at the bottom, we see our transaction type, and the status property is set to success. Okay, next I'm going to scroll back up, uncheck the confirmation box, and resubmit this request for processing. Notice that our response is similar. However, there's one very important new property that was added. That's order ID. This identifier is very important to the end user since it is what they will most often use to locate details or status about a pending or processed order. Also, if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see that the status property is set to order submitted. So there you have it. We've successfully created a suspend order request, confirmed the order, and successfully submitted it for processing. This process is the same for unsuspend as well as deactivate orders. For greater detail about some of the areas I discussed, I recommend watching a few of our other videos, including the ones for setting request headers and obtaining order properties. Each of these videos provides helpful explanations of how to complete these particular areas of an order request. I hope you found this video useful. For more information and tutorials on other topics, we recommend browsing the MobProc API video library at mobproc.tv and our documentation website at mobproc.info. That's all for now. Thanks for watching and have a great day.